Hello, this is Professor Brown-Cedarberg, and I'd like to look at calling methods from within a main method. So here I have developed a class that has a main method and a number of other methods. So we'll see here in main of this class, DemoMethodsFromMain, I have just declared 3 ints and given them values. But then we'll see that I have a number of methods, and let's look at each one. So this is our first. It's called add2nums. It is public. That means it can be called from a class other than this one. It can be called from the outside. It's static. That means it can be called using the name of the class in which it resides, in this case DemoMethodsFromMain, and then a dot, and then the name of the method, which is add2nums. So it's public and static. It returns an int. It has the name of add2nums, and it expects to have 2 ints passed into it. The first one passed in it refers to as n1, the second it refers to as n2. And what it does is it returns back the sum of n1 and n2. So it returns back an int as it promised. It is public, it can be called from the outside. It is static, it can be called simply by using the name of the class in which it resides, dot, its name, add2nums. It returns back an int, and that int is the product or the sum of the 2 ints that are passed into this method. So then we have our next method, which is sub2nums. What it does is subtracts one number from another. So it too is public, it too is static, but this one is void. And void means that it doesn't return anything. I have to say void, even though I'm not returning anything, but void indicates this method returns nothing. Its name is sub2nums, so I'll call this static method by the name of the class in which it resides, DemoMethodsFromMain, sub2nums. This method also expects 2 ints to be passed into it. It refers to the first as n1 and the second as n2. And what it does is it subtracts the second number passed from the first and simply prints that to the screen. So this doesn't return anything back. It's a void method. A method that returns something back has to say exactly what it's returning back and then return it with a return statement like this. Our third method is mult2nums. Now this method is private. Private means it can't be called from the outside. It can be only called by a method or from a method, within method, of the class in which it resides. It is static, so it can be called easily. It returns back an int, and it expects 2 ints to be passed into it. Again, n1 and n2 are the aliases of the ints passed into it. In it we have declared an int called sum. We've given a value of 0. And here we've got a loop. And within this loop, what we do is we call add2nums, the method here that we looked at right up here. Not main, but this one. And so this loop gives an initial value to a declared int I, give it a value of 0, and I'll continue going through this loop as long as I is less than n1, the first number passed into this method. And after the loop has been iterated through once, we'll increment I, as we do here, plus I. Now within the loop, what we do is we call add2nums, this method here, and pass to it the value of sum and the value of n2, the second number that was passed into this method. And so when we call add2nums and pass it 2 numbers, it adds the 2 together and then returns it back. So we'll return back the sum of n1 and n2. That sum will be returned back and stored into the space sum. So we'll iterate through this loop, adding number after number after number, right, as long as I is less than n1, the first number passed in. So what this does is it does a repetition of addition. It adds the second number passed in, the first number of times. So that's really multiplication. What happens here is we've got repetition and we're calling another method. And notice that we called this method with just add2nums. And we could do that because this method, add2nums, resides in the same class as this method, mult2nums. So I didn't have to use the class name. I could just call it with the name of the method, add2nums. Now this method, that mult2nums, is static, as is this method, add2nums. And so I could call add2nums as I did, because both methods are static. If I'm calling a static method as I do here, I must call it from within a static method or have an instance of the class in which the method resides called the other method. Here I've got 2 static methods, so I'm okay. So I go through this loop a number of times And after the loop's completed, we return back the value of sum. We return back an int as we had declared. So we look at our next method, and it's the method div2nums. It's public, it's static, it returns back a double. Its name is div2nums and expects to have two ints passed into it, n1 and n2. And what this one does is it does a test. It says, all right, is the second number equal to 0? Because what this method will do, it'll divide the first number by the second. And we know that division by 0 is illegal. And so we test to see if n2, the second number passed in, is equal to 0. And if it is, we go into this block of code and we print out that division by 0 is not allowed and that we are going to return 0.0. And that's indeed what's returned. So this return statement fires if this if statement evaluates to true. If this if statement does not evaluate to true, this return statement will fire and it will return back n1 divided by n2. So here we have a method that has two return statements, and that's fine. Only one will fire. And once one does, the method concludes. So if we were to pass in 0 as n2, we would print out this value and the method would end with this return statement. This return statement would never be reached. So you can have any number of return statements, but when one fires, that's the end of the method. The method concludes. The last method we have is this. It is mod2nums, and you note that this one is public. You'll note that it's not static, and a method is declared to be non-static by just not saying that it's static. This one returns back an int and expects two ints to be passed in, and it returns back n1, the first number passed in, divided by n2. Now you'll note that here in this method div2nums I put parentheses around n1 and n2, n1 divided by n2, and here I didn't. That's a matter of personal preference. Right? This will be evaluated and returned back. This will be evaluated and returned back. So that's a matter of personal preference. This method is public, non-static, returns back an int, mod2nums, and it expects two ints to be passed in. Now when I call this method, I'm going to have to call it differently than I did these. All of these methods were static, and I could call it just calling it by the name of the method. And I could call it that easily because it was these were static methods, and they resided in the same class as the method that I was calling them through. This one's non-static, so we're going to have to do a little bit more to call this method. So let's look at calling the methods. I've got my ints here, and let me call the method add2nums. So I'm going to call add2nums, and let me pass to it a and b. Now I'm going to pass it variables, and that's fine. I could pass it numbers, 10 and 15, but I'll just use a and b here. So when I call add2nums, I can call it this way. I can call it without using the name of the class in which it resides because it resides in the same class as the main method through which it's being called. I don't have to create an instance of DemoMethodsFromMain because both of my methods are static. From a main method, you can call another static method very easily, just like this. It's no problem. Let's call this method and let's have the result, what's returned back, and we know that an int is returned back. Let's have that printed to the screen. So I'm passing what's returned back by add2nums to the method println. And if I compile now, we'll compile and then run, I should have printed to the screen 8. And when I run, indeed that's what we have. So I've called the method add2nums. Now I'd like to call the method sub2nums. Now this one we see is void. It doesn't return anything back. It just prints to the screen. So I can very easily call this one just with sub2nums, and I'll pass it a and b. And we know from our examination of this method that sub2nums subtracts the second from the first and then prints that to the screen. So let's compile, and now we'll run, and we're subtracting b from a, and so we have 2 printed to the screen. B is 3, A is 5. So now let's call mult2nums. And mult2nums wants 2 ints passed to it. It returns back an int. And I'll call it and print out the value returned to the screen just as I did here. So I'm going to just copy this Whoops. I'm going to copy this, try again, and put here. And instead of add, I'm going to call mult. Now, when I call mult, we know that it in turn calls add. So let's compile this, and I'm passing to mult to nums a and b, and that's 5 and 3. So I expect to have 15 printed to the screen. So we compile, and now let's run, and we'll see that the last number printed to the screen is indeed 15, which is a times b. Now what happened when I called mult to nums is it in turn called add to nums. So let's look at this method, right, our public static double div to nums. Now remember that this method mult to nums that we just called is private, and I could call it from within the class, but that's the only place I can call it from. I can't call a private method from outside the class in which it resides. Public methods, I can call them from outside the class in which they reside, but a private, I can only call it from inside the class in which it resides. And that's what we did here. We were inside the same class and we called it. And notice that we simply called it using the name of the method because it's in the same class as the method from which it's being called. So here let's look at div to nums. And div to nums is public and static, returns back a double. And we'll do this. Let's just call div to nums this way. And I can do that this easily because div to nums, as we see, is static. Well, I'm calling it from a static method. It's in my own class, so I can do that. And if I div these two nums, one is 5 and one is 3, let's compile. And when we run the program, we should have the last number that's printed is the correct 1.0. Why is it 1.0? It's 1.0. It's 5 divided by 3. I wouldn't expect to get 1.0, but I created div to return an int. Oh, wait a second. I've created it to return a double. But it gave me back clearly an int. It gave me back an int because what I did here in my return statement was I divided n1 by n2, and I know those are both ints. I'm going to get an int back. So here's an example of where we should use casting. Now, I could cast this way, cast it into a double, but I'll still have the same result because this cast to a double will cast what's the result of n1 divided by n2. That's going to be an int. I'll just cast it into a double. That is, I'll add a 0.0 to it. So let's take that parentheses out and this one too. And now I'm casting n1 into a double, dividing it by n2. I'll have a double returned. So let's compile and let's see what our result is, and we have the correct result. So here, as I developed this method, it looked great. Everything was fine. I called it fine. But I hadn't taken care of this. I said I'd return a double. And what it did was it returned back the double version of this int division. So now we fixed that method. Let's go back up here and look at our last method. But let's look at div one more time. I fixed it. Well, let's try it again. And let's pass to it as a denominator the value 0. And that's C. C has a value of 0. Let's see what happens when I compile now and I run. And as I run, I expect to have this. Division by 0 not allowed. I'm returning 0. And that's what that method was engineered to do. Now if I call that method again, let's call it again. And instead of passing 0, I could pass C as the numerator and pass a number or one of my variables. I'll pass B. And so we'll compile and we'll run, and we'll see that as it tests those numbers passed into it, as long as the second number is not a 0, it will do just as it should. And here I've got 0 divided by 3. That's indeed going to give me back 0. Notice that it appends a 0.0 to that because I said that div2nums would return back a double, and that's indeed what it does. So then I've got mod2nums, and this is our only non-static method. So we're going to have to treat this one a little special. As we call it, we're going to have to call it using an instance of the class in which it resides. So it's mod2nums. Well, let's go back up here and try to call it. We know that it returns back a value, right? So let's try to call it up here. And what I'll do is I'll call it this way. I'll say mod, whoops, sorry, it should be mod2nums. And what I'll pass to it will be, I'll pass A and B. And with A and B, it's 5 and 3, so I know I should get 2 back. So let me try to compile this, and I get yacked at. I get yacked at because this method, mod2nums, is a non-static method. I can't call a non-static method just directly as I try to. I have to call it using an instance of the class in which it resides. So I have to create an instance of this class right here before I can call mod2nums. So let me do that. And so I am going to create an instance of the class DemoMethodsFromMain. And I'm going to name it X, not the best of names, but that'll do for now. And I'll create it with this keyword new, repeat the type, and there I've created it. So now I have X, which is an instance of the class DemoMethodsFromMain. I'll have X call the method mod2nums, and that will be accomplished with X dot. So now I have an instance of the class DemoMethodsFromMain. I've named it X, and it's calling the method mod2nums. Mod2nums is a non-static method. It must be called by an instance of the class in which it resides. And so let's try to compile. We have a clean compile, and now we'll run it. And if this runs as I expect, I should have my last number printed to the screen is a 2. So what we've done today is we've looked at methods that are being called from within a main method. We have methods that are public, static, return something, public, static, and don't return anything, private, static. We've got methods that are public, non-static, return something. We've got a variety of the methods. What's important for us to understand is that public means it can be called, the method can be called from outside the class in which it resides. Static means that it can be called using the name of the class in which it resides. A return type must be returned, and that's returned through the return statement. Any arguments passed into the method are local to the method and used in any calculation any processing that's done in the method. A private method can only be called from within the class in which it resides. A non-static method can only be called from an instance of the class in which it resides. Methods are one of the more sophisticated tools of Java. I suggest you take some time to explore them, and you'll learn how to use them. Thank you.